Welcome to Fast Pace, the new growth, leadership and management podcast featuring Josh Phegan and Dean Mackie. We wanted to peel back the layers on what happens in the world of fast-paced real estate agencies, from new leadership models to the management challenges we all face each day. This is about a new era in the estate agency sector. Rapid changes to business models, service lines, remuneration and growth present the greatest opportunities that we've ever seen. Sit back, get inspired, grow your skills and reimagine what's possible with Fast Pace. Every Friday, wherever you get your podcasts, on Spotify, Apple Podcasts and Josh Phegan Digital. Profit, growth or both? Dean, this is probably one of the interesting conversations. I think that in the very early days, we would talk about whether or not a business is in profit mode, whether or not a business is in growth mode, or whether or not it's possible for a business to be in both. And, there's always that conversation of investing ahead of the curve and making sure that you've got enough innovation. And then the old Tom Peters quote that literally if you're making a great profit, it's fantastic because then you can reinvest in the business. And if you reinvest, you reinvent. And if you reinvent, you look after the future. So naturally, there's got to be a bit of a stage. But what I see happen a lot in businesses is that I've got some business owners that are clearly in profit mode, and I've got some other business owners that really want to reinvest to actually take the business to where it needs to go. So Dean, talk to us a little bit about it. What is profit mode? What's growth mode? Is it possible to have a little bit of both, or are you in a position that naturally you've got to lean towards one? And what actually happens in a business partnership if someone's in a position that they're in a different mode to everyone else?
Thank you, Josh. Look, profit, growth, or both is an interesting conversation. I think that we'd all love to think that we could have both.
Yeah.
But I've learned over the years, you can actually have both, and it's desirable, but, they're not always compatible at the same time. It just really depends upon the goals of the business and what your objectives are. You said it perfectly there. If you're reinvesting in innovation and things for the future, you look after the future, then that's an investment in growth, right? But if you're focusing on profit, then what you're trying to do is actually maximize the difference between your revenue and your expenses, right? So and you want to be able to sort of say, well, the question is, what do you want to do with that profit? Because growth is all about reinvesting the profit into growth, but taking the money is actually, is different to investing it, right? So often you'll find, like, if a business is in, let's go for profit mode, it's all about how do you increase cash flow, how do you increase your return on investments, how do you increase dividends, and that sort of thing. I think that's really where, if you talk about being in profit, that's typically what a business would be doing in that moment. And they're probably a business that's flying in their own market, and they're probably at a stage where they've earned the right to do that. It's interesting though. So I've sort of found at different stages and sizes of business, you can actually be quite small and quite profitable. And there can be sort of a middle zone where you can have a decent sized business, but don't feel like you're making enough money, and you've sort of got to reinvest to go to the next level before you can get enough scale. So it just depends upon where you're at. So there is one thing I did learn. I have learned over the years, and it rings true no matter where you are. And you sort of, if you're wanting to take profit, I guess there's an adage I've always had in my mind, that you can't save yourself to growth. And often I find when things aren't going too well, often people will say, oh, well, we better cut overheads, and we better get rid of that job, and we better do all this sort of stuff. And I find that that's actually the worst time. Well, typically, it depends on what your objectives are, but I have found it's often the worst thing to do because, often you're doing it for some short-term business cycle need, and you're trying to get a bit of profit back in the business. But, because maybe shareholders have commitments they need to meet and they want the dividends and whatever, but often that's actually putting your own personal interest ahead of what's probably good for the business, because the minute you start letting people go, you lose IP, you lose, you changes culture, you can be seen as not giving support and resources you need to be successful, and all those sorts of things can come up. And in effect, I think that when you're cutting those costs, and you end up this sort of limiting growth, future growth by making cutbacks now. Now, if you don't want to grow into the future and all you want to do is cut it back lean and make profit, that's okay. But I think that what happens is when you start just focusing on profit, then you do limit your growth resources, you limit your innovation, you stop thinking about the possibilities, right? So there are different times in different businesses that's going to be totally appropriate and totally okay, So
I guess that the big challenge here for a lot of people though is that, like, actually identifying, okay, you might not be able to cost cut your way to greatness, but you can definitely reapply cash to better bets.
Oh, 100%. But exactly. So if you're reinvesting that money, you can reinvest it for growth or profit or both. And if you think about, I guess, if you think about a startup, right, someone's trying to get into a new marketplace or something like that, they're going to need to invest ahead of the curve, right? They're going to be chasing growth and they need to spend money, But there's often times in which a business is actually doing quite well. and it's chasing growth and getting profit. So I guess what are the benefits of chasing growth? If we sort of think about it, if you're in growth mode, you're trying to drive more sales, you're trying to pick up more customers, you're trying to pick up more market share. And, you're typically, in my view, to keep growing, you've got to invest ahead of the curve. So I'll give you a perfect example, right? We've moved into some new markets with new products. So, for example, in our Southern Highlands office, we didn't have a rent roll there up until a couple of years ago. So we've realised that there's a big opportunity there, but we also knew that over a series of a number of years, we'd need to invest ahead of the curve in terms of resources, people, BDMs, and all those sorts of things until such a time at which, so we're building the asset, and the asset has value, but the P&L is running at a loss. So if you were just picking it up and going, I'm wanting profit out of this business, and your objective was to take profit, then you're in the wrong business, right? Because the objective of this business is to grow and grow asset value and grow to the point at which profit is returned. But it comes down to your objective. So in that particular instance, this is about expanding. It's about scaling up. It's about trying to grow to then get to a point at which we can take advantage of efficiencies and economies of scale, right? Because without that, there's no way that I could actually even go ahead with that business. So I think that what you've got to think about is that when you're also investing in growth, I tend to think of businesses as providing more support, more resources, and more things to an organisation. And often I find that agents and people perform well in growth-orientated businesses because it gives them a growth
fun,
mindset.
it's exciting.
It's exciting, creates alignment, all those.
Always got something new that we can be working on.
Yeah. But the one thing I will say is that when you're scaling up or you're growing or you're looking to grow and chase profit, it can actually be quite tricky. And you do want both, right? You don't want to keep investing money forever and not see a return on it. It's got to have some sort of payback in the future. And often when you're investing and growing, you're actually looking for changes too, right? So you're actually doing a lot of these things that you're not always seeing the return on, not immediately anyway. It might be down the track. So I know, for example, we've invested in certain infrastructure that's not going to give me a payback, and also restructuring of processes that won't give me that we've spent this year that I won't see the benefit of until next year. Mm-hmm. But you've got to have that plan in place, because when you're going for growth, it's not always easy. It involves a lot of risk, right? And if you don't have someone handling the careful planning associated with getting the growth and the profit, you can make a big trade-off and get the growth and not the profit. If that makes sense. Just because you've got more revenue coming in doesn't mean you're going to be making more money.
And so, Dean, this leads us to a really important question about what happens when there's a bit of friction at the leadership level, where you've clearly got someone that is purely in profit mode only. And so I give you an idea on this, like there's an old school saying like you're going to run it on the smell of an oily rag, where all of a sudden they're just stripping out as much cash as they can from the business and never really allowing that reinvestment. And we've got certain firms across Australia where the director pool is getting very old.
Yeah.
And the problem is that the next generation that are coming through don't necessarily have the capital or access to capital to be able to buy out the older owners. But yet they're in a position that they're also in a position that they know where they need reinvestment, CRM and infrastructure and all of the above. And there's like this weird friction point between the existing business owners who don't want to reinvest because they just want the cash. But there's the next generation coming through. So we don't have the cash yet, but these are the big bets of what we need. That can cause a lot of problems inside of a business and ultimately even the death of a brand.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I tell you what, I saw Allen's have decommissioned a few lolly lines. There's no longer some lollies actually in Woolies, because this is exactly that point, right? They actually have the machines that are producing those particular products is going to cost too much to upgrade, and they're better off just getting rid of it altogether, right? So, did
you lose one of your favourites?
Yeah, I did actually, but let's leave that alone. And so did some other people. But it's a good point. It's being willing to make those investments in that infrastructure or whatever's required is because you're making a decision on the future base of the business. If you've got a whole bunch of directors who are currently thinking to themselves, well, I don't really have an exit because there's no one here who can afford to buy my shares, they're probably just looking to milk some profit out of the business. But, the problem there is then you might actually have people with you that then start to question your willingness around to innovate, to provide resources, that you may be there just for the money and all that stuff. And it can just change the culture and the course of your business. I think that you've got to, if you find yourself in that scenario, or even I think you also get some directors in the one business who end up with misalignment. So with all of these things, I think as an owner and as a leadership team, not just the owners, but the leaders have to be aligned around what your vision and what your values and what your goals are. And if you're out of misalignment, you've got to find a way to deal with that. Because if you've got two shareholders and one shareholder wants to keep investing to go to the next level, and the other shareholder saying, no, I want to get out, then you're going to have to start thinking about how you deal with that succession planning and that changeover, so then you're not going to end up with conflict and misalignment that could ultimately actually ruin the business.
Is it as simple as potentially when you're there with your leadership team, say, guys, where are the areas where we're in profit mode? Where are the areas where we're in growth mode? And are we happy with those situations? And so then that way we actually get some clarity, remove any friction, get rid of the misalignment, and just get going to do the things we want to do.
Well, it's a big conversation. Look, I know I've got a few shareholders in a particular region that need the cash flow, right? They've got their own personal commitments outside the business and they would like to see that happen. But for that business in that region, there's no cash flow coming out of it because it needs to recommit to investing in building because it hasn't got the number of sales agents and the sales performance that it needs. Its rent roll needs to grow. It's got a whole bunch of and if we were to try and take that view just to sort of cut it all back to try and generate some profit, the business would actually go into massive decline and would collapse itself. So for that individual, it's a matter of then saying, well, how do we help restructure your personal finances? Because or alternatively, maybe this is not the right vehicle for you.